I did not own the house I was thrown out of, and that was the first thing I learned to be grateful for, though it took a hard year and a harder winter to teach me. On the 9th of June in the year 1884, in a sodden timber settlement called Halver's Reach in the high country of Dakota Territory, my husband's brother stood in the doorway of the only home I had known for 11 years and told me, in the flat voice a man uses for weather, that the claim had passed to him and there was no room in it for a woman who could not give it sons. Linus Hale was his name, and he said it the way he said most things, with his thumb hooked in his belt and his eyes already turned toward the field. I was 34 years old. I had buried my husband in April, frozen ground, broken with a borrowed mattock, and I had buried no children because none had ever come. And Linus had decided that this last fact was the sum of my worth. He gave me until the harvest to be gone. He did not raise his voice. The cruelty of it was that he did not have to. Stay close, because what he could not see that morning, what none of them on the porch at Bren's store could see, was that I was not a poor woman at all. I was the richest soul in that valley, and the wealth was buried, and it was packed in salt and ash and sand, and the cold that was coming would prove it. They called me the Squirrel Widow, before the leaves turned. I want you to remember the morning Linus said it, because the universe was about to say something back. My father had been a cellar man in Pennsylvania before the war took the country apart and sent us west. And a cellar man is a particular kind of person, the kind who reads a hillside the way other men read a Bible, looking for the cool places where the earth keeps its own counsel. His name was Asa Coyle, and he was a quiet man with thick wrists and a way of standing still in a field that made other men think he was idle when he was in fact doing the hardest work a person can do, which is looking. He could walk a stretch of ground in the heat of July and tell you where the cold sat under it, where a spring ran shallow, where the rock came near the surface to hold the chill, and he had dug root houses for half the farms in our county before he ever dug one for himself. He died when I was 19 of a lung sickness that came on slow through 2 winters, and took him in the spring of the third, and he left me no land and no money and not so much as a good coat to bury him in. What he left me was in my hands and behind my eyes. He left me the knowledge of how the ground breathes. I sat beside his bed in those last weeks, and he did not speak of God or of money or of the war. He spoke of dirt, of the temper of clay against sand, of the way a north slope holds what a south slope spends. And I thought at the time he was wandering in his mind. And only years later did I understand that a dying man tells you what he most wants you to keep, and my father wanted me to keep the ground. I can hear you thinking that a hole in the dirt is a hole in the dirt, and that is exactly what Linus thought, and the council thought, and the whole settled, comfortable porch of Halver's Reach thought, and they were wrong in a way that cost some of them everything. My father used to crouch with his hand flat on the floor of a root house he had dug and say, "The earth is slow to warm and slow to cool, and a man who fights that is a fool, and a man who borrows it is rich. Slow to warm and slow to cool." I did not yet understand that June morning with Linus in the doorway that those 7 words were the only inheritance I would ever need, and that I had already been given them 15 years before by a man with his palm on the cold floor of a hill in another country, in another life, when I was a girl who did not yet know that listening was a thing a person could inherit. I took the wagon I was allowed, an old gray mule named Pard who had outlived 2 owners and most of his teeth, and a dog my husband had called Skiff, a low brown working dog with 1 torn ear, and a habit of leaning his whole weight against my leg when the wind came up, as if to remind me that some things would not leave even when everything else did. I took the tools that were mine by my own hand, the mattock and the 2 spades and the tamping iron my father had forged on a Pennsylvania anvil with my name and his initials struck into the haft, and I took a tin box of his, that I had never once opened in the 15 years since his death, because some inheritances you carry sealed until the day you are ready to spend them. I knew it held papers of some kind. I could hear them shift dry inside when I lifted it. But I had told myself for 15 years that I was not yet ready. And the truth I would not say even to myself was that I was afraid of finding it empty of anything I could use. Linus watched me load it all and said nothing, save one thing. He said a woman alone would not last the winter, and he said it kindly, which was worse, the way a man is kind to a horse he means to sell. The widow Pellet, who had been my husband's aunt and the one soul at the burying, who had held my hand, stood at the edge of the yard and told Linus to his face that he would answer for this, that there was a coldness in him that no fire would mend, and Linus only looked at her the way he looked at weather, and turned back to his field, and she was overruled the way kindness is always overruled by men in a hurry, with a shrug and a turning away. I drove Pard north and east to the only piece of ground no one wanted, a north-facing fold below a limestone shelf at the edge of the settlements, commons, a cold shadowed cut of hill the men called the ice pocket, because frost sat in it into May, and nothing would grow there worth the planting. They gave it to me the way you give a beggar the rind, glad to be rid of both the ground and the obligation in a single stroke. I looked at that north slope, at the limestone shelf above it holding the cold like a cupped hand, at the way the ground stayed dark and firm where the rest of the valley had gone pale and dusty with July, and where they saw a curse. I saw my father's whole life laid out in front of me like a made bed. The cold they were mocking me with was the very thing I had been raised to use. They had given me, without knowing it, the 1 acre in the territory my father would have chosen first. I began to dig on the 14th of June, and I dug into that hillside the way my father had taught me, not straight back but downward and then back, so the floor of the chamber sat well below the line where the summer heat could reach it, with the limestone shelf above as a roof the sun could never warm through. A root cellar is not a hole. A root cellar is an argument with the seasons, and my father had taught me to win it. I cut the entrance to face north and angled it so the prevailing wind would pass across the door and not into it, and I built the passage with a bend in it, a dogleg, so that no straight draft could ever run from the outer air to the inner room. It is slow work for one woman with a mule, the digging, and I learned to pace it against my own back, 3 hours in the cool of the morning and 3 in the cool of the evening, and the hot middle of the day spent hauling sand or shaping plank, and Pard hauled the spoil out in a stone boat I rigged from a wagon bed, and Skiff dug alongside me in the manner of dogs, which is to say uselessly, and with great joy, throwing dirt between his hind legs at nothing. I shored the chamber as I went with timber I cut and snaked down from the ridge, setting posts and a ridge pole tight against the limestone so the earth above could never settle down upon what I stored. The men who rode the Commons Road saw a widow throwing dirt and they laughed, and one of them, Orrin Tate, who kept the freight scales and considered himself the practical mind of the valley, reined up one afternoon and watched me a while and said, "You are digging your own grave, missus, and saving the parson a trip." He smiled when he said it, the easy smile of a man who has never once in his life been wrong in front of a crowd. I kept digging. I did not look up. My father had taught me that the surest answer to a man who is certain is the patience to let the year answer him for you. Skiff lay in the cool of the cut with his chin on his paws and watched Orrin the way he watched coyotes, steady and unimpressed. And when Orrin rode off, the dog sighed and shifted closer to the doorway I was opening into the hill, as though he had appointed himself the keeper of it. By the middle of July, the chamber was dug, 12 feet back and 8 wide and tall enough to stand in, and I began the work that the porch of Bren's store found the most amusing of all, which was the packing of it. I will tell you what I did, and you may judge for yourself whether it was madness. I lined the floor with a foot with of dry river sand on, hauled up from the creek in the wagon, load after load through the whole of 1 week, my hands cracked white with it by the end, because sand holds a steady cool and wicks no damp upward into what is stored on it. I built bins along the walls of split plank and packed my carrots and my beets and my turnips in layers of that same sand, each root not touching its neighbor, so that if one went soft, it could not pass the softness on. The way my father said, a barrel of sound apples and one rotten one will in a month be a barrel of rot, and the lesson in it was about people as much as fruit, though he never said so out loud. I stored my cabbages with the roots still on them, hung head down from the rafters I had set into the limestone, because a cabbage pulled whole keeps 2 months longer than a cabbage cut. I packed apples in a separate bin entirely, far from the roots, because my father had taught me that apples breathe out something that makes potatoes wake and sprout, and a sprouted potato is a starving potato. I salted down a barrel of beans and another of greens. I rendered what fat I could buy or trade, and sealed it in crocks under a finger of melted tallow against the air. I smoked fish from the creek over green willow and a side of pork I bought, with nearly the last of my coins, and I hung them in the cold, dry dark where no fly would ever find them. I gathered hazelnuts from the draws and dried them, and I put up wild plums in honey, and I traded 2 days of my labor at the Bryn place for a sack of seed wheat I parched and stored against the worst, and a person walking into that chamber by the end of August would have thought a family of men had been provisioning for a siege. All summer I packed that cellar the way a miser fills a sock, and all summer they laughed, and the laughter had a name now. The squirrel widow, hoarding against a winter that the almanac and every grandfather on the porch swore would come mild and late. Let them swear, I thought. The almanac is a guess in good handwriting. The ground does not guess. It was the second week of August when the woman came who would later carry what I knew out into the world, though neither of us guessed it then. Her name was Della Munn, and she was the new schoolteacher, 22 and sharp-eyed and prone to writing things in a cloth-bound book she kept in her apron, and she walked the Commons Road for her health and stopped one evening at my cut in the hill, because she had never seen a door like the one I had set into the slope, a low, thick door of double plank, with a span of dead air between the two skins of it. "What is the gap for?" she asked, and I told her the truth, that air does not carry the cold the way wood does, and a door of 2 walls with held air between them keeps the weather out better than a door of 1 wall twice as thick. She wrote that down. She had a way of asking a question and then waiting, not filling the silence the way most people do, and I found I would tell that silence things I had told no one about my father, about the lung sickness, about how a person can be left rich in a way that does not show in any ledger. She came back the next evening and the one after, and she asked a great many things over the weeks that followed, and I answered them all, because my father had told me once that knowledge hoarded rots the same as apples, and only knowledge given away keeps. Della wrote down the sand, and the dog-leg passage, and the north face, and the cabbages hung head down, and the way I had banked earth and sod against the outer door to the height of my shoulder. She wrote down the little vent with its tin baffle, and the reason for it. And when she did not understand a thing, she said so plainly, which is rarer in a clever person than you would think. She did not laugh. She was the first soul in that valley who looked at my work and saw work, and on the evening she told me, almost shy, that she meant to keep her notes proper and orderly in case they were ever of use to anyone. I felt something I had not felt since my father died, which was the particular warmth of being taken seriously, and I have come to believe it is as necessary to a person as fire. September came in dry and bright, and the men of Halver's Reach got their corn in, and their hay stacked, and their confidence up, and at the harvest social held in the half-built grange they made me, for one evening, the entertainment. I had come for the food and the company, being lonely as only a cast-out woman can be lonely, in a loneliness that is not the absence of people, but the presence of people who have agreed you do not quite count. And I stood at the edge of the lamplight while Linus told the room that his late brother's widow had spent her summer burrowing like a badger and packing dirt full of vegetables enough to feed the territory. The room laughed. Orrin Tate raised his cup and called out the name across the heads of the crowd. There she is, the squirrel widow, and they laughed again. Warmer now, the way people laugh at a thing they have all agreed to find funny. The way a town laughs to make itself feel like one body instead of 40 frightened ones. I did not answer them. There is a kind of patience that looks like weakness to people who have never needed it, and I had needed it a long while. A boy near the cider barrel, no more than 10, looked at me with the open face of a child who has not yet learned which cruelties are permitted, and he did not laugh. And I have remembered that boy longer than I have remembered any of the men. I found Della by the door, and she walked me out, her jaw set hard. And behind us the fiddle struck up and the dancing started. And Orrin's voice followed us into the dark, mild and pleased with itself, saying she will be selling us turnips at $1 a piece come spring, and won't that be a sight? He was nearly right about the spring. He was wrong about who would be glad of it, and he was wrong about the price, because I never sold a one. I gave them away. The last time the name was thrown at me before the cold came was on the 1st of October at the freight office where I had gone to buy nails, and it was Orrin again, comfortable behind his scales, who looked up and said to the man beside him, "Mind you keep clear of the squirrel widow's hill, or she'll have you packing turnips in sand." And the man laughed, and I paid for my nails and said nothing. And 2 days later the wind came down out of the north, with iron in it, and Orate had said that name aloud for the last time in his life. The first sign came on the 3rd of October, 3 weeks early, and it came as a wind out of the northwest that had no business in early October, a wind with iron in it, a wind that smelled the way the inside of a well smells. I knew that smell. My father had taught me to know it, had taught me that the air goes thin and metal tasting before a great cold, the way a room goes quiet before bad news. I brought Pard into the lean-to I had dug against the cellar's flank, and I forked him deep straw, and I carried Skiff's bed inside the chamber itself, and I checked my door and my banked earth and the little vent I had cut high in the limestone with a baffle of tin over it, a vent so small the men would have laughed at it too had they seen it. But a cellar that cannot breathe will sweat and rot everything in it, and a cellar that breathes too freely will freeze, and the whole art is in the breathing. That night the temperature fell off the edge of the world. By dawn the water in the trough was a solid block, and the thin skin of the creek was ice you could walk a mule across, and across the valley I could hear cattle bawling and men shouting, and the particular silence underneath it all. That is the sound of people realizing they are not ready. I stood at my doorway in the iron dawn, with Skiff pressed warm against my leg, and I did not feel triumph, whatever you might expect. I felt the old grief come up fresh, because I knew what a cold like that does to people who have laughed instead of dug, and laughing is not a crime that ought to carry such a sentence. What came down on Halver's Reach in the second week of October in the year 1884 was a cold that the old men would measure the rest of their lives against, a deep continental freeze that rolled down out of the north and sat on the high country for 19 days and did not lift. On the worst of those nights, the spirit thermometer at the freight office, the one Orrin Tate kept for his records, read 38 degrees below zero, and then it read nothing at all because the spirit had drawn down into the bulb and there were no more numbers. Below it, I will give you the arithmetic of that cold the way I came to learn it, household by household. because it is the only way to make a person feel a thing they did not live through. The Penders, who had laughed loudest, had laid in corn for fuel and burned it in 3 days, and then they burned a fence, and then they burned the bed of a wagon, and they lost 40 head of cattle, standing frozen in the lee of a wall that did not break the wind. The Tate household burned through a winter's wood in 11 days and started in on the rails and the porch boards by the second week. 2 homesteads at the valley's far edge lost their stored potatoes entirely, frozen to black mush in cellars dug straight and shallow into south-facing ground, cellars that took the day's thin sun and the night's killing cold in equal measure and held neither, which is the whole difference between my father's craft and man with a spade and a hurry. A family named Orr lost their milk cow and then their seed corn and then very nearly their children to the cold that came up through a plank floor, laid straight on frozen ground. 11 people died in that valley, and the 2 valleys beyond it before the freeze broke, most of them old, 2 of them from a family that tried to walk 4 miles to a neighbor through the second night and did not arrive, and were found in the spring not far from a fence they had been following in the dark. I do not tell you these numbers to harrow you. I tell you them so you understand what my father's 7 words were standing against, and how small a thing it is, a hand flat on a cold floor, and how much it can hold. Inside my hill, the cold could not get in. I want to be plain about how that felt, because it is the center of everything I have to tell. The chamber held at a hair above, freezing through the whole 19 days, never warmer, never colder, because the earth around it had spent all summer holding the season's warmth and gave it back slow, exactly as my father had said it would, slow to warm and slow to cool. The dogleg passage stopped the wind dead at its bend, so that even on the night the thermometer gave up. There was no more than a faint stirring of the lamp flame in the inner room. The double door held its skin of dead air. The little baffled vent breathed out the day's damp and breathed in nothing of the killing draught. I burned almost nothing. A small fire of an evening for the cooking and the company of the light, because a body and a mule and a dog in a closed earth room give off heat enough to keep a small space from the worst, and the worst was the only enemy I had to beat. While the valley fed its furniture to its stoves, I sat in my borrowed warmth and mended harness by lamplight, and the steadiness of the place was such that I could lay my bare hand on the limestone wall and feel it cool, but never cold, the rock holding the line my father had promised it would hold. I had carrots firm as the day I pulled them, snapping clean when I broke one for pard. I had cabbages and apples and smoked pork and a barrel of beans and crocks of fat under tallow, and I had pard alive in his straw with frost on his whiskers and warmth in his hide, and I had Skiff warm against my side with his torn ear twitching at sounds in his sleep. On the 7th night of the freeze, when I heard a sound at my bank door that was not the wind, a small broken knocking like a branch against a pane, I had something I had not counted on, packing through all those laughing summer weeks. I had the chance to give it all away, and I understood in the instant I heard that sound that this, and not the surviving, was the thing the whole summer had been for. It was the Pender girl, the eldest, 14 years old, and sent because she was the lightest and quickest, come stumbling the half-mile across the killing dark, because her family's fire was down to a fence rail and a baby brother was blue at the lips. She could barely speak when I pulled her in past the dogleg into the warm dark, her lashes white with frost, and her words coming in broken pieces. "Fire's gone," she said, and "the baby," and could not finish either one. I did not let her try. I wrapped her in a quilt and put hot broth in her hands and held them around the cup until they stopped shaking, and I sent her back, not on foot but on pard, with Skiff trotting at the mule's head to keep the way through the dark, and a side of smoked pork lashed across the saddle, and a sack of dry kindling and 3 crocks of fat, and word that the Penders should bring the baby and the old grandmother to my hill that very night if they could move them at all. They came. They came stumbling out of the dark that had been laughing at me in September. The same Penders who had laughed loudest, carrying the baby wrapped in everything they owned. And I brought them in past the dogleg into the steady cool that felt to them coming out of 40, below like the breath of summer itself, and the grandmother wept when the warmth touched her face and could not have told you why. By the 9th night I had 9 souls in a chamber dug for one woman's turnips, 9 people breathing in the dark that held above freezing, while the world outside fell past 40 below, and I fed them from bins they had spent the summer laughing at. Nobody laughed in my hill. There is no room for it in a place where the work has been proven. They slept in shifts on the sand floor, with the children laid in the warmest center of the room, and the children slept through, which is the truest measure of a safe place there is, and the cold pressed on the limestone shelf above us and could not find a way down. The baby's lips went from blue to pink in a single night, and his mother sat against the bin of carrots and watched him breathe and did not sleep at all, the way a person will not sleep for fear the mercy will be gone when they wake. Orrin Tate came on the 14th day, when the freeze had broken its back but not yet let go, walking because his horses were dead, his face wrapped to the eyes, sent by the half of the valley that was burning furniture to ask the squirrel widow whether there was anything in her hole in the ground that could be spared. I brought him in through the dogleg, and he stood in the doorway of the chamber with the warm dark in front of him and the cold at his back, and he saw the bins and the hanging cabbages and the apples and the people and the mule alive and the firm bright carrots in their sand, and he was a long time saying anything at all. The frost cracked and melted off his wrappings and ran down his coat. He took his hat off in a root cellar, which is a thing I had never seen a man do. Then he said the only thing there was to say, and he said it low, with no smile in it anywhere. "You knew," he said. "Just that. You knew I told him to take what the wagons could carry and to send them back for more. And he did. And we kept the far end of the valley alive on a widow's hoarded summer, for the 5 days it took the cold to finally lift. The freeze let go on the 22nd of October, and the valley counted its dead and its living, and the counting changed something that did not change back. They did not call me the squirrel widow after that, not because anyone forbade it, but because the word had stopped being funny, and a thing that has stopped being funny falls out of a person's mouth on its own. They did not have a new name for me right away either, and I think that silence cost them something, the way it costs a proud man to stand in a doorway with his hat in his hand. By the next summer, there were 4 new cellars dug into north-facing ground in Halver's Reach, and the summer after that, a dozen, and the men who dug them came first to my hill to stand in it and feel the steadiness of it and ask their questions, and I answered everyone, because knowledge given away keeps. Orrin Tate came and dug his own and dug it well, and brought his eldest boy to learn the sand and the dogleg, and that boy grew into the best cellar man in 3 counties, and never once in his life called the work anything but the widow's method, though I had told him plainly the method was my father's and older than my father besides. Some of them got it wrong. Some dug straight back without the dogleg and wondered why the wind reached their stores, and some skipped the sand and lost their roots to damp, and one ambitious man dug too shallow under a south slope to save himself the hauling, and froze a whole winter's food in a single week. And from their failures, I learned the bitterest part of my father's lesson, which is that you cannot give a person the principle by showing them the shape. The shape they could copy, the understanding they had to earn the way I had earned it, with a hand flat on the floor of the earth, listening. Della Munn wrote all of it down, the successes and the failures both. for she had grown wise enough to see that the failures taught more than the triumphs. She filled her cloth-bound book, and then years later, when she had left teaching and gone to the territorial agricultural office, she put what I had told her into a bulletin that went out to every settlement on the high plains under a plain title about the cold storage of roots in northern exposure, and my father's 7 words went out into the world wearing other clothes. And I have met farmers 200 miles from that valley who keep their winter stores by a method they could not name the source of, which is exactly as it should be. For the best inheritance is the one that forgets whose it was. I opened my father's tin box. At last on the night the freeze broke, with 9 people asleep around me on the sand. I had carried it sealed for 15 years. Inside there was a folded paper in his hand, a drawing of a cellar in cross-section, with the north face and the dog leg and the held air door, all marked in his careful lines, and under the drawing he had written, "For when you have your own ground," and below that, the same 7 words he had said with his palm flat on the cool earth. Slow to warm and slow to cool. He had known, even dying, that the inheritance was not the drawing. The drawing was only the shape. The inheritance was that I had been the kind of daughter who would crouch beside him and put my own hand to the floor and feel for myself what the words meant, so that when the day came, I would not be copying a picture but remembering a truth, and a truth lives in the hands long after the paper has yellowed, and the hand that drew it has gone to ground. Linus left the valley 2 years after the freeze, his brother's claim worn out under a poor manager's hands, and I never wished him ill and never saw him again, and the not wishing was easier than I had feared it would be, because a person who has been proven right by the impartial earth has no appetite left for the small meal of revenge. I stayed. I dug a 2nd chamber and a 3rd, and I never married again and never wanted to. And the children of the people I sheltered grew up and dug their own cellars into the cold ground their parents had once called cursed, and the ice pocket, the cut of hill no one had wanted, became the most coveted ground in Halver's Reach, and they renamed it without ceremony. The way places get renamed until the old name was gone, and a new generation called it the Keeping Slope and did not know why. I am an old woman now, and I have outlived nearly everyone who laughed, and I have outlived most who learned, and the cellar I dug in the summer of 1884 is still there on the side of that hill, still holding a hair above freezing in the worst of January, still breathing through its baffled vent, still keeping. I go up to it some evenings when my knees allow, with a lantern and a slow old brown dog who is the grandpup of the grandpup of the dog who leaned on my leg, and I stand in the doorway where Orrin Tate took off his hat, and I put my hand flat on the cool floor the way my father taught me, and I feel the earth giving back the summer it has held all year, slow and faithful and exactly on time. The hillside above is green now, with the cellars of 3 generations cut into it, little doors facing north into the wind, and from the far ridge at dusk, you can see the lantern light bleed warm out of a dozen low openings into the cold blue dark, each one a held breath, each one a borrowed warmth, each one a thing the earth was always willing to give to anyone patient enough to ask. My father told me the only inheritance worth having is the kind that lives in the hands. He was right. The hands are gone to ground now, both his and soon enough my own, and the warmth keeps coming up out of the hill all the same.